It's good to be with you again this week. Last week we started this journey through the New Testament. Now, why the headphones? Well, I'm really not listening to anything, but some people think that this is how the Bible was started. God speaking directly into the ears of whoever wrote it, and the people writing it were writing it word for word. I said last week that what we do is we'd start with a few questions that sprang from last week. And so there's three that I picked out. The first one is, well, if God doesn't speak directly into someone's ears as they're writing, what does the church mean when they talk about divine inspiration? Now, there's a problem if we think that God spoke word for word what they wrote. I kind of hinted at it a little bit last week. The Bible has a lot of different styles of writing, and some of them, frankly, just aren't that good. The Gospel of Mark is notorious. It's very rough. It's choppy. It's barely literate. And so when we talk about inspiration, what do we mean? Well, first of all, there's a number of different authors, and I don't think any of them really had any idea that what they were doing is writing something that would be considered scripture to a later generation. You had people like Luke who said, hey, I've interviewed all these people just so I can write an orderly account of the things that have happened. Paul, he wrote, sometimes he was answering questions like the book of 1 Corinthians. He had a letter from the group of people there asking him a series of questions, and he responds, hey, now for the matters you wrote about. And he begins to answer one by one. Galatians, he's so upset that he completely skips any compliments or this section that's known as a Thanksgiving section just to rush in and say, I'm astonished that you've so quickly abandoned what I've taught. So when we talk inspiration, we're not talking about a wooden someone just writing down in dictation the words that they hear. Rather, they're writing down something that's important to them with their talent and their ability, limited very much by their language. So when you have Matthew, we shouldn't be surprised to find that it's a book written toward Jewish believers. Luke is written toward Gentiles. So what is called the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, you would expect that from a Jew, kind of comparing these words to what happened to Moses, is described in Luke as the Sermon on the Plain, where Jesus is just one of us, just an everyday guy. And so we're limited when we talk about inspiration. They are real people who God used, but in real life situations. But let's not even stop there. When we talk inspiration, churches collected these letters. They copied them. They read them, said, okay, this is really good. This isn't so good. And trust me, we have lots of letters and lots of books from the same time that the church said these just aren't good enough to make it. They're not important enough to be copied. They're not important enough to be considered vital for the life of the church. So you have the collecting process, the copying process. Then there's people that gave their life to protect it. That's part of the inspiration process. Even today, people with skill translate it from the original Greek into languages all over the world. And before we stop at inspiration, I think there's a little bit of inspiration that happens to the reader from time to time. There have been lives changed down through history because someone has stumbled on just the right words at just the right time. And in a time of stress or a time of hardships, when they read the words, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside quiet waters where he restores my soul, and find themselves strangely warmed. So inspiration is more than just a wooden dictation theory of Scripture. Here's the second question. The second question is, and it kind of springs from the first one. You know what? I've read my Bible and I find discrepancies. I find things that just don't match. What do I do with that? And what's your answer for that? Well, here's my answer. You're right. You're absolutely right. You have noticed what is there. You're not the first to notice it. I noticed it. I noticed it at 13 and 14 years old. And a lot of other people have as well. We shouldn't let that bother us too much. Let me just give you a couple instances where things are a little different. In Mark and Luke, where Jesus heals a blind man and heals a man possessed by demons, in Matthew, it's two. It's two blind men. Matthew just tends to double things up a little bit. We notice differences on how many people went to the tomb on Resurrection Sunday. We notice differences throughout a lot of the rest of these stories. They just don't quite match up as well. And we shouldn't be surprised at that. Here's one big reason. What the authors are doing are different. Luke tells you right off the bat what he's doing. Hey, it seemed good for me to write an orderly account of the things that have happened in our midst. So I investigated and I interviewed the eyewitnesses and I wrote down this account. John tells you something else. John says, I'm writing this just so you'll believe. He's writing to get you to a point, and they're right up front with it. That's different things. I already said before, Matthew and Luke come from completely different perspectives. But let me give you one other place that I think is kind of illustrates this. If you've seen any like the Jesus film, or even if you've seen some of the movies that depict the life of Jesus, you know that when Jesus was carrying his cross up to Calvary, he was burdened, he was struggling because he had already been beat up pretty bad. He couldn't get the cross up to the top. So they stopped, they took the cross off his back, pulled a guy out of the crowd, and had him carry the cross for Jesus. The guy was named Simon. And he carried the cross for Jesus. Well, that's not what John says. The Gospel of John says Jesus carried it all by himself. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all agree that Jesus dies on Good Friday, and we have that holiday now, Good Friday, to mark that day. Would it surprise you to notice that the Gospel of John, that's not the day Jesus dies? He dies the day before Passover, which is not Friday. Well, wait a minute. How could I trust the Bible if it can't get its facts straight? Because the Bible's not there to deliver data. It's there to tell a story in a truthful way. Did you ever think that when John writes those words, he has a completely different agenda in mind? Let's go back to the Old Testament just for a second. Think about what dies the day before Passover. The Passover lamb dies. The sacrifice for the nation of Israel. Perhaps when John says that Jesus dies the day before Passover, he's not trying to tell you what day on the calendar Jesus died. He's trying to tell you who Jesus was when he dies. And he's our sacrifice. He's our Passover lamb. He's the willing, obedient son who's willing to be sacrificed. And so he's telling you something truthful. He's not delivering little data points. If you were Jewish and you lived 2,000 years ago, you'd have understood that intuitively right away. We don't. We have our own little tricks in literature. If I started off and I said, hey, I got a great joke, knock, knock, you'd all respond, who's there? No one taught you that. That's just kind of one of our forms. This was one of their forms. We're just separated by 2,000 years. So we shouldn't force this book to answer our question in the way that we're used to, because it wasn't written primarily to us 2,000 years ago. Then there's one other question that kind of springs from one of the claims I made last week, where I said Jesus was probably raised as a Pharisee. And some of you were saying, well, what do you mean by that? There's no way Jesus was a Pharisee. He was the enemy. I mean, he was the enemy. The Pharisees were the enemy. Let's just be careful here. Let's not let our assumptions get in the way. Here's why I would say that. Well, Nazareth was the town that Jesus was born, well, not born into, but was raised in as a child. We have pretty strong evidence that Nazareth was a very conservative place and was the center for the Shammai school of the Pharisees, which was the most conservative and the most devout group that there was. The people who were part of this group usually identified themselves by what they named their children. They named their children after patriarchs. So maybe if they had a son, they'd have named him Joseph. Had a daughter, they might have named her Miriam or Mary from the Old Testament stories. So we were able to locate Mary and Joseph in this spot. Then let's connect the dots with me. Jesus goes to Jerusalem for his bar mitzvah at age 13. He stays behind. He's in these discussions with the Jewish leaders because he's comfortable. Nazareth would have been a place where a boy would have had a pretty good chance at some pretty specific Jewish training. Keep going forward. Jesus keeps getting these confrontations with the Pharisees. They kind of know him. Aren't you the carpenter's son? Hey, we're not illegitimate. They know the story. Jesus is good at debating and talking with them because he's been through the same training that they have. This is not just a wild guess. This is kind of based on where he was and who he was and how he responded to folks. Oh, and one last thing. The Gospels clearly tell us that Jesus was kicked out of his hometown. And where did he go? He went to Capernaum, which, by the way, was the central focus for the Rabbi Hillel, I'm sure you've heard of them, school of Pharisees. They were in Capernaum. So where did Jesus go? Of all the places he could go, he went to the opposite school center place for the other group of Pharisees. This is what we do when we engage in biblical scholarship. We try to uncover the story behind the story. Read between the lines. It enriches the meaning that we get from it. That's what we'll be doing through these next couple weeks. As we start next week, we're going to be going through and starting with the book of Mark. I know it's not the first book of the Bible, that's Matthew, but it is the first gospel written. And it's not the first chronologically, those are Paul's letters, but we'll start with the Gospels. I think it's probably important to start there. And as you go through this, hey, send us a question, say hello. I want you guys to drive some of these topics, even if we get kind of off topic with a random question. We want to do it. We'll be introducing some other folks through the next couple weeks, and glad you're joining us, and just invite you back every week as we kind of walk through this New Testament from a very scholastic viewpoint. Why can we trust this book? Why has it been important? And why has it been kind of the most important piece of literature ever produced in the Western world? Hope to see you soon.